What if I told you that one of Zambia's most controversial whistleblowers, Chilufya Tayali, has just dropped a political bombshell? A shocking claim linking former President Edgar Lungu directly to Joe Malanji's corruption deals. Could this be the evidence that changes everything about the Lungu family's legacy? Or is it just another political smokescreen? Tonight, we uncover Tayali's explosive allegations, the Malanji connection, and what this means for Zambia's fight against corruption. Stay tuned, because the truth behind this scandal will leave you stunned. Chilufya Tayali has once again set Zambia on fire with claims that Edgar Lungu, ECL, was behind Joe Malanji's corruption deals. This explosive revelation adds new pressure to the Lungu family's ongoing legal and political battles. In this video, we expose Tayali's shocking claims against ECL and Malanji, why the Lungu family remains tied to corruption scandals, the role of Zambia's courts and political rivals in shaping this case, what this scandal means for HH's government and the 2026 elections. This isn't just a story about corruption, it's a battle for power, legacy, and Zambia's future. The whisper in Lusaka. Imagine this, a secret so big it could bring down two of Zambia's most powerful men. A deal whispered in corridors, hidden in sealed envelopes, protected by silence. But silence never lasts. Tonight, we begin with a story that shook Lusaka, a whisper that turned into a storm, a whisper that named two men, Edgar Lungu, former president of Zambia, and Joe Malanji, the flamboyant businessman and politician. And the man who broke the silence? Not a government investigator, not an international journalist, but Chilufya Tayali, a controversial figure known for drama, secrets, and survival. Why did he speak out? What did he know? And how deep does this secret pact go? In the streets of Lusaka, people had heard rumors. Money that disappeared. Projects that never started. Deals that made no sense, yet made some people rich. But the names were never clear. Until Tayali stepped forward. Until he pointed fingers. Until he claimed that corruption was not just an accident of government, but a deliberate pact. Think about that. Not random theft. Not small bribes, but an agreement at the highest level. A pact between Lungu and Malanji. So how did this begin? The whisper started quietly. A small group in Lusaka talked about the deal. No documents, no recordings, only rumors. At first, few believed it. After all, powerful men have always been accused of corruption. But something was different this time. The whispers kept spreading, from ministers to businessmen, from diplomats to journalists, until the name of Malanji appeared. Who is Joe Malanji? Known as Bonanza, Malanji lived like a man who had more than politics could give. Luxury cars, private jets, mansions. Some called him a businessman. Others called him a money man. But Tayali called him something else. The key to Lungu's secret deals. Here's the question. Why would a former president trust Malanji? The answer lies in their friendship and in money. Malanji was not just wealthy. He was useful. Useful in moving money. Useful in silencing questions. Useful in protecting the image of power. But every pact has a weakness. Every secret has a leak. And that's where Tayali enters. Chilufya Tayali is not an ordinary whistleblower. He is a man with enemies everywhere. Sometimes loved, often hated, but always listened to. When Tayali spoke, people paid attention, not because they believed him, but because he often had access to secrets no one else dared to reveal. So when he said Lungu and Malanji had a corruption pact, Zambia stopped to listen. But here's the problem. Why should anyone believe Tayali? Was he telling the truth, or was he creating a story to destroy his rivals? Or worse, was he being used by someone else? As Tayali told his story, more questions rose. What exactly was this pact? Where was the money? Who else was involved? The whispers suggested that millions disappeared. Funds meant for projects never reached the people. Instead, they were redirected. Some say into foreign accounts, others say into election campaigns, and some claim into pockets. But no one could show the paper trail. No one could prove the pact. Only whispers. And yet, those whispers grew louder. Here's the twist. Some insiders claim the leak did not start with Tayali, that he was only the messenger, that the real betrayal came from within Lungu's own circle. A friend turned enemy, a deal gone wrong, and Tayali was chosen to speak what others could not. If true, then Tayali was not the hero. He was the mouthpiece of a deeper war among Zambia's elites. But let's step back. Why does this matter? Because this whisper was not just about two men. It was about trust. It was about a nation's wealth. It was about whether Zambia was being led or being looted. The The people wanted answers. The media asked questions. And the government remained silent. Was silence a sign of guilt? Or was it proof that Tayali was lying? The streets of Lusaka buzzed. Taxi drivers debated it. Markets spread it like wildfire. Everywhere, people asked, did Lungu and Malanji really make a secret pact? And while people argued, another question rose. What would happen to Tayali? A man who speaks against giants rarely walks free. Would he be silenced? Would he be arrested? Or would he survive because someone powerful wanted him alive? And so, the whisper in Lusaka was born. A whisper that shook faith in the powerful. A whisper that opened the first crack in the wall of silence. A whisper that forced Zambians to ask, who do we trust? But here is the cliffhanger. If this was only a whisper, what happens when we uncover the money, the projects, the documents, the betrayal within the circle? Because this is just the beginning. And in the next, we follow the trail of money from Lusaka to foreign banks, from empty projects to secret accounts. And we discover why the partnership between Edgar Lungu and Joe Malanji was not just friendship, but a business of power. The kingmaker and the banker. Every empire has two types of men. The king who holds the crown, and the banker who holds the purse. In Zambia, during Edgar Lungu's reign, those roles became clear. Lungu was the president, but behind him stood a man who seemed untouchable, Joe Malanji. This episode is their story. One man searching for power, the other feeding him money. Together, they created a pact that some call the most dangerous in Zambia's history. So, who was Edgar Lungu, the so-called kingmaker? To the public, he was a leader. To his party, a strategist. But to his critics, he was something else. A man who rose to power not by vision, but by survival. Lungu's strength was not in charisma. It was in knowing who to align with, who to silence, and who to reward. That's why he needed a man like Joe Malanji. Because Malanji was not just a politician. He was a banker without borders. A man with wealth so vast, no one really knew where it ended. Joe Malanji, nicknamed Bonanza, a man of style, speed, and spectacle. He drove luxury cars in Lusaka. He flew private jets as if they were taxis. He built homes that looked like palaces. But here's the question. Where did the money come from? Officially, he was a businessman, but the lines between his businesses and politics were blurred. Very blurred. And this was exactly why Lungu trusted him. Think about it. A president needs money to stay in power. Campaigns are expensive. Allies are greedy. And politics, especially in Africa, is a game of who can fund loyalty the fastest. Malanji became that lifeline. He was the banker who kept the machine running. When the party needed cash, he had it. When elections loomed, he delivered. When enemies rose, he bought silence. But no banker works for free. So, what did Malanji want in return? This is where the story turns dark. Insiders claim that Lungu gave Malanji more than friendship. He gave him access. Access to government contracts, access to diplomatic networks, and access to state resources that could be twisted into private wealth. Some call it mutual benefit. Others call it corruption. But whatever name you give it, one thing is clear. The king and the banker needed each other. Still, their partnership was more than money. It was survival. Lungu knew his power was fragile. Critics were circling. The economy was struggling. And public trust was fading. But Malanji gave him strength. With Malanji's money, he could buy time. With Malanji's network, he could build alliances. With Malanji's loyalty, he could face threats. And Malanji, he knew that with Lungu's signature, doors opened. Projects were approved. And critics stayed silent. But behind this bond, there was always suspicion. Did Lungu trust Malanji completely? Or did he fear him? Because here's the paradox. The same man who funds your empire can also destroy it. Some ministers whispered that Malanji had too much power, that he was bigger than his position, that he could bring the president down if he chose to. And in politics, that makes a man dangerous. So, was Malanji just the banker? Or was he quietly becoming the kingmaker? Look closely. During key decisions, Malanji was always there. His wealth shaped strategies. His money influenced campaigns. And his presence in foreign capitals from South Africa to Europe gave him reach beyond Lusaka. At times, it seemed like Lungu was the face, but Malanji was the force. And this is where Tayali's revelation stings hardest. When he accused Lungu and Malanji of a corruption pact, he wasn't just naming two men. He was exposing a system, a machine of power built on money, loyalty, and secrecy. But remember, every machine breaks, and every pact has an expiry date. The cracks were already forming. Questions about Malanji's wealth were growing louder. Foreign banks were looking closer, and rivals inside Zambia were sharpening their knives. This was not just friendship anymore. It was a ticking clock. One wrong move, and the empire would collapse. And perhaps that's why whispers began in Lusaka. Because someone inside the circle saw the weakness, and someone decided it was time to leak. So here's the question you must ask. Was Lungu in control of Malanji, or was Malanji in control of Lungu? Was the president the king, or just another player in the banker's game? This is where we end episode 2, the story of the king and the banker. Two men who needed each other. Two men who trusted and feared each other. But what happened when the money trail grew too obvious? When offshore accounts began to surface, and when investigators, both local and international, started asking questions that could no longer be ignored. The money that vanished. Money never lies. It always leaves a trail. But in Zambia, under Edgar Lungu and Joe Malanji, that trail went cold. Too cold. This is the story of millions that vanished. Projects promised but never built. Budgets approved but never delivered. And accounts that opened in Zambia but closed overseas. It's a mystery that still haunts Lusaka. Where did the money go? And who helped it disappear? The whispers began with a road project. It was supposed to connect villages. It was supposed to change lives. The money was allocated. Contracts were signed. But years later, nothing. The road never came. Then there was a hospital, announced with pride. Funds released. But the land remained empty. No bricks, no walls, no doctors. And yet, the money was gone. This wasn't one case. It was many. Too many to ignore. And when journalists tried to follow the money, they found something strange. Payments were made. Receipts were written. But the companies behind them were shadows. Shell companies, paper offices, businesses with no staff and no equipment. Who owned them? That's where Malanji's name kept appearing. Joe Malanji was more than a politician. He was a man with reach. He knew businessmen across borders. He had accounts in different countries. He had friends in banks that rarely asked questions. So when the money vanished, suspicion turned toward him. Was he the banker of the Pact? Was he the one who made the money disappear? But here's the twist. Not all the money vanished abroad. Some of it stayed in Zambia. Only it didn't go to projects. It went into politics. Election campaigns suddenly looked expensive. Billboards appeared everywhere. Rallies with free gifts. Cars branded with slogans. Cash flowing to supporters. Where did all that money come from? Whispers said the projects. The same hospitals, roads, and schools that never happened. Think about it. A project is announced. Funds are released. Half is spent. Half is redirected. On paper, the project exists. In reality, it's a ghost. And ghosts don't ask questions. Here's where it gets darker. International auditors tried to check. They flagged irregularities. They raised alarms. But the system pushed back. Reports were delayed. Investigations stalled. Files disappeared. And the people, they were told to wait. That development takes time. But how long can you wait when the money is already gone? Enter Tayali again. When he spoke about Lungu and Malanji's pact, he mentioned the projects. He claimed he had seen documents. He said the missing money was not an accident. It was designed. But critics asked, where is the proof? Did he really have it? Or was he repeating what insiders fed him? Still, the story spread because it fit the reality people already saw. Empty schools, unfinished bridges, broken promises, and behind them, the vanishing money. Let's follow one trail. A payment leaves Zambia. It goes to a foreign company. That company transfers it to another, then another, until it lands in an offshore account. Simple, clean, invisible to most eyes. But investigators in Europe whispered that some of these accounts linked back to familiar names. Politicians, businessmen, even diplomats. And yes, Malanji's name appeared again. But here's the danger. Money trails can expose more than corruption. They can expose alliances. And that's why this story is so explosive. Because if true, the money that vanished wasn't just about greed. It was about power. It was about funding loyalty. It was about building an empire that looked stable on the surface, but was hollow inside. So, who betrayed the pact? Who leaked the whispers that led to Tayali? Some say it was angry insiders. Others believe it was foreign partners who felt cheated. And some think it was part of a bigger plan to weaken Lungu and end his empire. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. The money was gone, and the people were left with nothing. Now, imagine this. What happens when the money that feeds an empire disappears? Allies grow restless. Supporters lose faith. Enemies smell blood. That's exactly what began happening in Zambia. The cracks grew wider. The silence grew heavier. And the whispers became louder. This is where the story shifts. Because missing money is one thing, but secret deals, sealed with handshakes and promises, are another. And in Lusaka, there was talk of such a deal. A pact made in shadows, protected by loyalty, but threatened by betrayal. A deal so dangerous, it could explain everything. The missing projects, the vanishing money, the silence of government, and the courage of Tayali to speak out. This is where we end episode 3. The story of the money that vanished, the ghost projects, the empty promises, the millions that slipped through Zambia's fingers. But the real question is not where the money went. It's why it was taken, and who truly designed the pact that made it possible. The deal in the shadows. Every empire has a secret secret pact, a deal made far from the public eye. No cameras, no microphones, only whispers, handshakes, and sealed envelopes. For Edgar Lungu and Joe Malanji, that pact was not just friendship. It was business, it was survival, and it was hidden in the shadows of Lusaka. Think about this. How do you move millions without anyone noticing? How do you promise contracts without public bidding? How do you build loyalty without using your own money? The answer is simple. You make a deal in the shadows. Here's how the whispers describe it. Step 1. Government projects are announced. Hospitals, schools, roads, bridges. Step 2. Budgets are inflated. On paper, the costs look normal. In reality, they're double, sometimes triple. Step 3. Contracts are handed to shell companies. No offices, no staff, no equipment, just names on paper. Step 4. The money is shared. Some to the projects, most to the pact. And who manages this cycle? The president with power and the banker with access. Lungu, Malanji, together. But who came up with it first? Did Lungu use Malanji as a tool? Or did Malanji offer Lungu a system he couldn't resist? That's the mystery, because even insiders can't agree. Some say Lungu was always the mastermind, a quiet operator who knew how to hide behind others. Others argue Malanji had the network, the bankers, the businessmen abroad, the system. Either way, the pact worked. 4 years. Here's where it gets darker. The pact was not just about money, it was about power. Imagine this. You're a politician. You want influence. You need money for your campaign. You go to Malanji. He provides cash. No questions asked. Now you owe him. You owe the pact. This is how control spreads. Not through laws, not through votes, but through debts. Some call it corruption. Others call it strategy. But one thing is clear. The pact became bigger than politics. It became a shadow government. And Tayali's revelation, that's why it was so dangerous. Because exposing the pact wasn't just exposing theft. It was exposing the very system that kept power alive. Now, let's ask the question. Who protected this deal? A pact this big doesn't survive without guardians. Officials who look away. Auditors who stay silent. Judges who dismiss cases. Some reports suggest bribes were built into the system itself. Not as accidents, but as policy. If true, then the pact wasn't just two men. It was a network. A web stretching from Lusaka to foreign banks. A web designed to trap anyone who touched it. But every web has a weak thread. And the whispers suggest that weakness was betrayal. Someone inside the circle got greedy. Someone wanted more than their share. And when they didn't get it, they leaked. At first, small hints, numbers that didn't add up, documents that went missing. Then Tayali's voice, loud, public, dangerous. Here's the twist. Was Tayali working alone, or was he just the mouthpiece of that betrayal? Because if someone inside the pact wanted revenge, they needed a messenger. And who better than Tayali? A man reckless enough to speak. A man dramatic enough to be noticed. A man whose enemies already called him a liar. Perfect cover. If he was telling the truth, people would doubt him. If he was lying, the pact stayed safe. Either way, the real betrayer stayed hidden. This is the darkness of the deal in the shadows. It's not just about who took money. It's about who knew, who stayed silent, and who finally decided to break the silence. But let's not forget the people. Because while the pact grew rich, Zambians grew poor. Hospitals without medicine. Schools without teachers. Roads that turned into dust. Every vanished kwacha left a scar. And every scar made the whispers louder. This brings us to the cliffhanger. If the pact was real, if the money was stolen, if betrayal leaked it, then what happens when proof appears? Because whispers are powerful, but documents can destroy giants. This is where we end episode 4. The secret pact, the handshakes, the betrayal, the whispers that turned into Tayali's voice. But in the next episode, the question becomes deadly. Who betrayed the pact? Who risked everything to leak the truth? And who will pay the price? The fall of the pact. Every empire ends, some in fire, some in silence, but they always fall. For Edgar Lungu and Joe Malanji, the pact that once looked unbreakable was now trembling. What began as whispers in Lusaka had grown into an international storm, and no amount of silence could hold it back. The cracks began at home. Paranoia consumed the inner circle. Friends became suspects. Allies became enemies. Every leak, every rumor was a dagger in the dark. And when trust collapses, even the strongest pact begins to crumble. Then came the betrayal. The whisperer within, whoever they were, had fed Tayali enough ammunition to ignite a fire. And once the fire caught, it spread beyond control. The media sharpened its teeth. Opponents smelled blood. Even those who once stayed silent began to speak, sensing the empire's weakness. The shield of fear was broken. But betrayal alone does not kill an empire. Exposure does. And that exposure arrived in the form of documents, bank records, contracts, signed papers that carried the weight of truth. For years, whispers had been dismissed as gossip. But paper has memory. Paper cannot cannot be denied. The documents showed inflated projects, strange transfers, shell companies with no offices, no workers, but millions in their accounts. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were proof. International pressure followed. Banks abroad froze suspicious accounts. Watchdogs demanded answers, and whispers turned into headlines. Lungu and Malanji were no longer just Zambian politicians. They were names in global investigations. Their pact had left fingerprints in places far beyond Lusaka, and those fingerprints could not be erased. But empires don't fall quietly. They fight. Behind the scenes, there were desperate moves. Allies were called. Favors were cashed in. Efforts were made to silence voices, to make the noise disappear. But the noise was too loud. Every attempt to cover the truth only made the whispers louder. Every denial looked weaker than the last. And then came the final blow. Division within the pact itself. Some insiders chose survival over loyalty. They offered cooperation in exchange for protection. They turned their backs on the very system they once defended. This is the tragedy of corruption. Loyalty lasts only as long as the money flows. Once the flow is blocked, loyalty vanishes. And just like that, the pact began to devour itself. For Tayali, this was both victory and danger. He had spoken loudly, recklessly, but now the world was listening. The information he shouted into the streets was suddenly on official desks. Powerful desks. But when the truth becomes official, the messenger is no longer needed. And that made Tayali more vulnerable than ever. Would he survive the very storm he had unleashed? For Lungu, the fall was bitter. A man who once held Zambia's highest office now faced whispers of disgrace. His legacy, once defended by loyalists, was drowning in accusations. And though he denied everything, the shadow of corruption clung to his name. For Malanji, the storm was even darker. His wealth, once a symbol of power, was now evidence. Every car, every house, every flight was a question mark. How was it paid for? Where did the money come from? The very image he had built became the weapon that destroyed him. And for Zambia, the fall of the pact left a scar. Because every kwacha lost to corruption was a hospital without medicine, a school without teachers, a road left broken. The people had paid the price, and now they demanded justice. But here is the haunting truth. When one empire falls, another begins. The whispers may end for now, but the system that birthed them does not vanish overnight. Because corruption is not just about names. It is about networks, and networks survive. This is the end of one story. The fall of the pact, the betrayal within, the trail across borders, the whispers that became proof. But it is not the end of corruption. It is not the end of secrets, and it is not the end of the questions that remain unanswered. Because even as this empire falls, another rises. And in the shadows of Zambia's politics, there are always new whispers waiting to be heard. This was the fall of the pact, but the next question is even bigger. If Lungu and Malanji fell, who is next?